Good morning. Well, it's good to be out. It's good to be in this place. And I don't know if it's good to turn this thing on or not. Mark and Cindy are out of town, so this Lord's Day I'm filling in as best as I might try. Next Sunday, John will step up here and fill in, so we hope that you will still come out, that you will still find something useful in terms of what we talk about today. One of the things that happens when Mark and Cindy are leaving us this time is they're helping Cindy's parents move. They're moving into a new house. Now, if any of you have ever moved, and I think that takes all of us probably to account, you find out you've got stuff, and you have more stuff than you imagined. And you're trying to figure out, what am I going to do with all of this? How can I get it from this place to that place? So that's what Mark and Cindy are doing, and they're helping Cindy's parents move. And they were going to downsize. And if you talk to Mark and Cindy about it, they're not sure there's anything called downsizing involved with this move. In 1974, we moved, Leila and I did, from Speedway, Indiana to a place called Valparaiso. And we had a 6-month-old, our first one. And we moved into a house, a little tiny house. We lived there 22 years before we moved into our new house in 1996. And we call it the new house, so we've been there 24 years. And we moved a lot of stuff from that first house to the second house. But there's one of the things that we moved that you probably would not think about as important, but it would rank right up there. We had to figure out where that was going to go. It was a measuring stick. The first mark on that measuring stick was in September of 1979. That was our first daughter. So we got a mark on there. We got the date, we got her name. The last mark on that measuring stick after we moved into our new house was in September of 2004, our youngest, Matt. From 1979 to 2004, that stick we can look at. We can see the names, we can see the dates, and we see the progress of their growth. That first mark that we made for Matt was in 1982 at 1 foot 8 inch. I think that's when we finally could get him to stand still, long enough to actually make a mark. But also in that year, 1982, we made a mark for Leila's brother, her youngest brother, Uncle Bob. Uncle Bob was 6'2" and a quarter. And all those years, everybody looked at Uncle Bob, 6'2" and a quarter inches. He was the standard. Our kids literally looked up to Uncle Bob. This morning, I kind of want us to take a look at some of the things that we measure ourselves by. There's a stick out there, a measuring stick. There's a standard out there. And every once in a while, we need to back up to it, and we need to take a little measurement to see where we stand in comparison to the standards that are there. The spiritual standards, the standards of our character, the standards of our growth. I think James probably gives us in the first chapter some of those. And it kind of exemplifies our character. It's the thing that every once in a while we need to take a look at these concepts of spiritual growth and who we are, so that we can figure out where we measure up to those. In James, the first chapter, there's an idea here in verse 19 and 20 That's the idea of self-control. It's the first one I take a look at because that's one I have a hard time with. Now, in the verse 19, it says that we should be swift to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath. And in verse 20, it says, for the wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God. That's the definition of self-control. We need to take a look at who we are and how we conduct ourselves. And we have a saying right here, you need to listen more than you talk. You take it in, you evaluate it, and you don't respond in anger. That's not self-control. Remember when Paul preached to Felix in Acts the 24th chapter, verse 25? It said that Paul reasoned of righteousness. The old King James uses that term temperance. That means self-control. And judgment to come. And when Paul reasoned to him about those things, it said Felix trembled. You know, when you think about how we're supposed to control ourselves and how we are supposed to conduct ourselves, sometimes it shakes us up a little bit. Because we don't do those things very good. And so Felix said, hey, I understand this Christian thing, but I'm not ready for it. I'm not ready for it. That's a big thing for you to ask for me. I need some more time. We don't know whatever happened to Felix, but I would imagine that Felix never responded to that. Galatians, the 5th chapter, verses 22 and 23 talk about the fruit of the Spirit. And when we look at the fruit of the Spirit, we see that it's love, joy, peace, long-suffering, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance, self-control. And it says there's no law against any of these things. These are the things that are constructive. These are the things that are positive. And Peter, in the second Peter, 1st chapter, verse 6, says that we are to add to our knowledge this self-control. And then when we have self-control, we need to have patience. So James, in that 1st chapter and going all the way down to verse 26, this self-control means we need to bridle our tongue. We need to have control over what we say and when we say it and how we say it. And I have to work on that. Self-control. Verse 21, James gives us another measuring stick, and that measuring stick is purity. And this is one of my favorite verses in the scriptures, and some of you know this. Verse 21. Lay apart all filthiness and superfluity of naughtiness. That's the old King James. Those translators were having fun that day when they put that together. But I love that phrase, superfluity of naughtiness. They invented a word. I know they did when they put that together. Now, most of your translations will probably say, avoid the appearance of wickedness. Now that gets right down to it. We know what that means. So there's a purity about us, and that purity means we're staying away from that. We're not reveling in that wickedness. We're not being naughty like a bunch of little children that need a father to correct them. In 1 Timothy, I lost that thing, didn't I? It doesn't want to be where it's supposed to be. Hopefully you're able to hear me. So in 1 Timothy, the 4th chapter and verse 12, it says, Timothy is told not to let others despise his youth, but what he's supposed to be an example in purity. So he's supposed to keep himself clean. He's supposed to be an example. So Paul is telling Timothy, you stand up against that measurement and you see where you are, because this is one of the standards that you need to keep as a young man. In Titus, the 2nd chapter, the 14th verse, another one of those interesting phrases, the old King James says that he purified unto himself a peculiar people. You know, Jeremy Jones, Jeremy's dad, said that what that means is that we're supposed to be peculiar people, and he said some of us are more peculiar than others. But it means the idea of a special people. We talked about this morning in terms of being called out, that we are a church, we are a family, we are brethren. Jesus has called us to be a certain kind of people, and that idea of being a special people, a peculiar people, is that we are to be a purified people. That's one of the standards that we're hoping that we have in our life. Now, where do we get those things and those qualities? Well, we have to be able to have a reception. In verse 21 of that first chapter of James, it says to receive the engrafted word. The word is something that we're supposed to take in. We're supposed to be willing to listen to it and receive it. We're supposed to be able to allow that word to change us. That's the whole idea. And Jesus in Matthew, the 13th chapter, in verse 23, talks to us about the parable of the sower. And he says that in that parable, but he that receives the seed into the good ground is he that heareth the word and understands it, which also bears fruit and bringeth forth fruit, some 100-fold, some 66, and some 30. So the whole idea here of the sower is that there are those that are going to receive it. And when you receive it, it can change you. It can make you productive. That's the whole idea that the sower is expecting. So the word changes us. We're supposed to receive that word. In 1 Thessalonians, the 2nd chapter, and verse 13, when we receive the word of God, ye receive it not as the word of men, but as it is in truth, the word of God, which effectually worketh also in you that believe. So when we receive it, we're supposed to believe it. And when we believe it, it changes us. It works in us. That's God working in us. Not us working. God working in us. We have to receive that particular word. Proverbs. When the father talks to his son, in the 1st chapter he says to know wisdom and instruction, to perceive the words of understanding, to receive the instruction of wisdom, justice, and judgment, and equity, to give simply to the simple, to the young man knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and will increase learning, and a man of understanding shall attain unto wise counsel. The proverb, the writer of wisdom, says we're supposed to receive the words of instruction. It's supposed to change us. We're supposed to understand it. We're supposed to listen to it. We're supposed to seek after it. Not only understand it, but apply it. There's a difference between studying and doing. There's a difference between studying and knowing and doing. It takes all of those together in order for there to actually be something that will change us. Verse 21, James gives us another term here that we can measure ourselves by, and that's meekness. Sometimes we think of meekness as weakness, and that's not what this verse is telling us. Verse 21, wherefore lay apart all superfluity of naughtiness, and receive with meekness the grafted word, So there's a reception here, but we receive it not in a way that causes us to say, well, I don't agree with that. We have to submit to that. That's an idea of meekness. Paul writes in Ephesians, the 4th chapter, again, one of my favorite verses, and I like the term in the Old King James, and I know that the other translations use it differently. It says, walk worthy of the vocation. Most of your translations probably say calling. Walk worthy of the vocation wherein ye are called, with all lowliness and meekness, with long suffering, bearing one another in love. A definition of meekness: bearing one another, forbearing in love. The idea of the vocation here, or the calling here, is that we understand what a vocation is. We understand what work is, that we commit ourselves to a career, to training, so that we get better and we learn. That's why I like that term vocation. Years ago, when I was working and had a career, not retired and taking naps, there was a writer, his name was Thomas Wolfe, and he said that Martin Luther, in his writings, changed the view of how the common man, how the peasant at that time, could view himself. By this verse, he said that every man that works has a vocation, and in that vocation can serve God in a way that's acceptable and a way that can elevate him. Not the only vocation that they looked at that time was the priest, the one that controlled the word. It was chained to the pulpit. Thomas Wolfe said that Martin Luther gave the common man a value and a way to serve in his everyday occupation. What he did, do it the best that you can. In a meekness, in a humbleness of mind, regardless of who you are and what others may say your station is, God says you've got a purpose and a value. So walk worthy of that purpose and that value. Colossians, the 3rd chapter, the 12th verse. Put on, therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, the bowels of mercy, kindness, humbleness of mind, meekness, long-suffering. And then in verse 13 following, forbearing and forgiving, even as Christ forgave you, so also do you. So in that meekness, we are working to serve others. Jesus, in a meekness, gave up his position. Jesus, in a meekness, served us in death. Jesus, in meekness, forgave us. And if we follow that pattern, we stand ourselves up against the measuring stick, we better find ourselves forgiving others and serving others. That's the meekness. 1 Peter, the 3rd chapter, verse 4, talks about the Christian attitude. Here it's talking about wives, but it's talking about the Christian attitude. It says that the hidden man of the heart. Let it be the hidden man of the heart. We don't see that inside of a person, but we can see their character and how it causes them to behave. The person that's in there, it's our heart, it's our soul. It's the meekness that others can see that we're trying to achieve. Verse 22. I like this one too. Be ye doers of the word. The idea of verse 22 is obedience. That's the standard that we're looking at. You know, we can have all of these other things and working on them, but it's basically comes down to the fact that we have to do what we have received. We have to do what we've understood to be done. It's a obedience in our life and following Christ that others will see. James again in that 18th verse says, a man may say that thou hast faith and I have works, but I'm going to show you my faith without works. No, I'll show you my faith with my works. James says, my faith is something that I've got. My obedience to the Word is something that I have, but you don't know that, and I can't show you that unless you can see what I'm trying to do. We can't just sit there. We have to be actively involved. We have to be doing some things. Jesus says there's something that we have to do. In Matthew, the 7th chapter, as he's talking there in verses 21 through 27, he says, whoever heareth these sayings of mine and doeth them, he says he likens them to the man that built his house on a rock. Not the man that built his house on the sand, but he likened to the man that built his house on a rock. There's a foundation there. That doing, that obedience, that gives us the grounding. It gives us the anchor that we can always go back to. And we can structure our lives around that following, around that obedience, around that listening. And then in verse 27, compassion and charity. He simply says to visit the fatherless and the widows in their afflictions. Matthew, the 10th chapter, verse 42. Who shall ever give to drink unto one of these little ones a cup of cold water only in the name of a disciple? Verily I say unto you, he shall no wise lose his reward. Just a cup of cold water. Let him that steals, steal no more. Ephesians 4th chapter, verse 28. But labor so that you can help someone else. Compassion, charity. The reason that we are here is to help others that are in need. Acts the 6th chapter, one of the earliest events in the early church that we see, that the Grecian widows were not being taken care of. And so the apostles came together and says, we've got to solve this problem. Let's select some men known as deacons, servants, to take care of this need. Compassion and charity. Jesus in the 25th chapter of Matthew, verses 34 through 40, we have some reading there that's hard, but the central point of that is, I was a stranger and you took me in. And they said to him, well, when did we take you in? He said, when you did it to the least of these of my brethren, you did it to me. The central thing that we have to do is we have to see, are we compassionate towards others? Do we have a charity towards others? Are we willing to help others? That's a measuring stick that we've been given. Verse 27. After we've done all of these things and working on these things, the last part says that we have to keep ourselves unspotted from the world. I tell you what, that's a hard one. You go to school, you go to work, you turn on your television, you look at your iPhone, you listen to the news. The world out there, we've got to watch that. We've got to make sure that it doesn't change us. The Word's supposed to change us, not the world. Ephesians, the 5th chapter, verse 20 says, give no place to the devil. Sometimes we've got to turn it off. That's why we get together as many times as we do, and maybe we should do it more, is to keep the world there. To keep the world there. More than 6 feet. Hopefully it's out there and it's not changing us. 1 Timothy, the 6th chapter, verse 14. That thou keep this commandment without spot unrebukable until the appearing of the Lord Jesus Christ. Doesn't stop. Jesus is coming back, and when he comes back, he's going to check us against that measuring stick. He says, there's Unspotted. How did you do? Once in a while, we got to back up against it. 2 Peter, the 3rd chapter, verse 14. Wherefore, beloved, seeing that ye look for such things, be diligent that ye may be found in him in peace, without spot and blameless. That's our goal. So when we're doing all of these things and we're measuring ourselves against these things, we've got to find ourselves in a place where we can see who we are. At the end of James, verses 23 through 24, it's interesting as we read this other comparison of a measuring stick. For if any be a hearer of the word and not a doer, he's likened to a man beholding his natural face in a glass. For he beholdeth himself and goeth his way, and straightway forgetteth what manner of man he was. I remember somebody a number of years ago tried to be a Christian, tried to lead his family. But it came springtime, and at his work, they had a softball league. He loved to play softball. And at the end of every game, they went to the bar, and he could not refuse going. And as the softball league time got longer and longer, the less time he spent at church, more time he spent with the guys, not just after softball at the bar. And then, the latter part of the summer and into the fall, we could work with him because the softball league stopped. And we tried to bring him back. And it continued to be that for several years. Young man, a lot of things that he was dealing with. But he looked at himself in the mirror. He looked himself on the pole of his growth, and he forgot. He forgot who he was. He forgot. He looked in the mirror, and he saw who he wanted to be, but then he turned away, and he forgot. That's not what we're about. God doesn't want us to do that. Jesus didn't die for us to do that. He came here to give us a word and a measuring stick and some things that we could back ourselves up to every once in a while and mark it off and say, I'm still working, I'm not there. Uncle Bob's 6'2.25". I'm not going to get there, but I'm still eating my vegetables. I'm still wearing my mask. I don't like it. There's some things that I have to do because it's just smart and it's wise. And I'm listening to the instruction of others and saying, I don't like it, but it makes sense. And maybe it's helpful not only to me, but it might be helpful to someone else. My family, my neighbors, my community. I want things to be growing. I want to look at that measuring stick and saying, I'm working towards that. That's where I want to be. I look at myself in the mirror and I say, I think I've got an idea of who it is that I want to be, and when I turn away, I can't forget that I've got a job to do. I can show you my faith by my works. Christianity is a doing religion. So each of us have to make a commitment. Each of us have to take a look at what it is that we understand and we study. And then we have to make a choice. At the end of a lesson like this, we offer an invitation. Someone might need some help. Someone might need some prayers. Someone might need to confess Jesus as their Lord and be baptized in water and let God work on them. Because that's what baptism is. God works on us. If you're subject to that invitation, if you want to take a look at what it is that your life needs to be about, or if you need some help, please come as we stand and sing.